So, Gwen, I really want us to start perhaps to either the months or weeks building up, you'll tell us, and that conversation that you and Dave Smuts had when you seriously started considering starting the Namibian. We had a small chat with him. He did tell us it was about the time that you left the Observer, excuse me.
Yeah.
So it was in that flux period of, you and other colleagues not having a job and you helping out with secretary work and all of that. But take us into that conversation.
Well, it's maybe not a conversation, but a series of conversation, obviously over many months. But I think one has to start with the story of the Observer. And Dave might have mentioned a bit, I was the political editor on the Windhoek Observer, a newspaper I had started with Hannes Smith way back, in fact, on the day that Kasinga was bombed, on May 4, 1978. Yeah. That was the day we brought out the first edition of the Observer. And after a number of years on the Observer, and I was political editor, my political writing, because I've always been a political animal, was very much focused on trying to show Namibians, people in general, that SWAPO had a human face, that it wasn't just a terrorist communist organization that, as it was depicted by the then apartheid regime. So I think things came to a head at the May 1984 Lusaka independence talks when President Kaunda then tried to bring about a settlement to the Namibian conflict and the negotiations, which were kind of at a stalemate at that stage. Needless to say, the conference itself was not successful. But what I did when I went to Lusaka was I did a number of interviews with, obviously, SWAPO leadership. And I came back and covered a number of pages full of copy with interviews and photographs and things like that. So that really irritated the South African authorities. The fact that I had given SWAPO this human face, that I had also attributed the breakdown of the Lusaka talks to the issue of linkage. And that was the South Africans and supported by the Americans and a number of other countries believed that a settlement could not happen in Namibia in terms of Resolution 435 of the United Nations because of the linkage of the Cuban presence in Angola. Until the Cubans were out, they were not prepared to consider a settlement. So I attributed the breakdown of the talks to this issue, and that was exactly what they didn't want people to know. They wanted people to think that it was SWAPO that was intransigent and just didn't want to come to the table. So to cut a very long story short, things came to a head after that. Smitty got a new partner on board because he was really battling. The newspaper was really existing on the advertising, such as it was, plus his sort of savings. And when they ran out, he brought on board another partner, Thurston Salt, who then wanted to try and obviously create more revenue for the paper. And they pinpointed me as the cause, because of my pro-SWAPO writings, that advertising was not forthcoming from the white business community. So everything came to a head. And eventually one day I received a letter from the Windhoek Observer management to say that I was being demoted as political editor and that I was not allowed to write a political column anymore. And that column was kind of the lifeblood of political life in Namibia at the time. And I'd written it since my early days at the Windhoek Advertiser prior to the Observer. So things came to a head. They demoted me as political editor. The staff rose up and demanded my reinstatement. Management refused. And this is where Dave really came into the picture. He was a person who'd been a friend of mine, and he had acted in legal capacity for some of the many cases, court cases we'd had in my time at the Observer. One, for example, was the banning of the newspaper, where we had appealed the ban, and Dave had assisted along with Brian Olin to basically get the paper unbanned. And so Dave was a friend and a legal colleague, and I'd asked his help because I was very concerned at the time. He helped the staff draw up a petition asking for my reinstatement. Management, as I said, refused, and basically the staff left and I followed suit.
So they didn't leave because they were fired per se. They left sort of in support of your demotion.
Absolutely. Basically because of that, and then as a result they were fired because of and I was also given my marching orders. So we were basically out on the street in the cold. There were a number of us. I can't remember the exact total now, but it was about 10 people in all. Yeah, we were jobless. There was nowhere to go. The business community here and the media landscape was very much in the clutches of the South African government, and if they weren't in the clutches, then they certainly weren't going to get involved and employ people like myself or any of the other staff, because it was quite a highly publicized event. And so I remember going home and feeling really, really hopeless about the situation. I still had, I was a single mother at the time with a young child, and I didn't really know what to do.
Yeah.
I was a freelancer for the BBC at the time and several radio stations in South Africa, but it certainly wasn't enough to make a living. And equally, all the other staff who walked out were kind of blacklisted by the local business community. Many of them tried to get jobs, couldn't get jobs, were told, shown the door because of their association with me.
Yeah.
And so I remember sitting at home the one day and thinking, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And then I got the idea, why not try and start another newspaper? And if I managed to do so, the first thing I would do would be to offer those staff who'd walked out on my behalf jobs at that new newspaper.
Yeah.
I knew it was going to be an incredible hurdle to try and do that, but I was fairly determined. And so I started the discussion with a number of people, very close people, because it was something that I felt had to be kept under wraps. Had the South African authorities caught wind, which they did eventually, that I was planning such a thing, it would have been kind of nipped in the bud very quickly. So I talked to a number of people, among others, Anton Lubowski, Nico Bessinger were very close confidants. I knew that if I started a newspaper, there was no ways, I had nothing, and there would have been no funds available here in Namibia to start that. And so I knew we would have to get external funding. There was a problem as well because of the sanctions, boycotts of the South African regime. It was very difficult to get money into the country. And one of the only ways one could do it was through the churches and with the sanction of SWAPO. So I knew that was my first step, really, was that I would need to get, at the time, President Sam Nuyoma's, can one say, approval for any outside body that was prepared to help start off this newspaper, that I couldn't do it without that.
Yeah.
And so, because they were, as you know, recognized by the UN at the time as the sole and authentic voice of the Namibian people. So I spoke to Nico and Anton Lubowski, who was at the time very close to former President Sam Nujoma, and discussed this with them. And obviously there was a lot of toing and froing, because I remember Anton and I having a discussion at one time and him saying to me, a SWAPO newspaper. And I said, no, Anton, not a SWAPO newspaper. This would be, I've always been a believer in a free and independent press. And that means a press that is not controlled by any political party or corporate interests or government or anything else. I'm totally opposed to that and still am today. So then Anton sort of slightly warmed to the idea, but he thought it should be a SWAPO paper. And I said, no, definitely not. This has to be independent. Yeah. And if the powers that be outside do not believe that such a newspaper is possible, then I won't get the funding for it. And those conversations were obviously followed up at a later stage with President Nujoma himself, which I'll get to in time. Anyway, we started immediately. Among others, I also spoke to Dave as a colleague and a friend. about these possibilities. I remember there were a lot of people in my close circle who I spoke to who were very, can one say, negative about the idea. They all said, Gwen, you are too much in the eye of the tiger. You will not be able to start. They will never allow you to do that.
Yeah.
And if you do manage to get a newspaper off the ground, it will very quickly be banned or destroyed. But
is this still in 1985, perhaps beginning of the year?
No,
or
that is still in
84?
1984.
Okay.
1984.
Late 1984.
Exactly. And then things came to a head in the course of 1984, where obviously the authorities started to get wind that something was happening. And then I was arrested in December 1984. I had found in my mailbox an interception order from the head of the security police in Pretoria for the interception of all my incoming and outgoing mail for reasons of state security. It's a long story and quite a humorous story with hindsight as to how this came about. But anyway, then I was immediately arrested because I found this document in my mail and I circulated it among all the journalists, everybody, the whole of South Africa, especially the liberal establishment there, for years had said that the South Africans were monitoring mail and opening mail and tapping telephones, and always they denied. And here was proof.
Yeah.
Here was the proof in my hands. So I arrived home after a press conference where I'd circulated this photocopied document of the interception order, and not long after that, I knew the police were going to come, and they did indeed. They came to the house and they demanded all the copies and the original order, and I told them that that was not with me, that I had in fact lodged that with Dave at the offices where he was working then of Lawrence and Bone, which were kind of the liberal law establishment in town. And so they arrested me at the house, took me to Dave's office, walked into Dave's office and demanded copies of this, and Dave handed over. I think he kept one back because I was kind of winking, I don't let them all go. So anyway, that was part of the drama, and then they immediately, of course, took me off to jail, and I was charged under the Official Secrets Act, the Internal Security Act, and a whole lot of plethora, the Post Office Act, and a whole lot of laws. And eventually charges were dropped because they knew that they'd be the laughing stock of the world, because this was going to really focus attention, my case, on the fact that they were in fact intercepting mail and monitoring. So as I say, that was really how Dave and my association built up, that he acted for me in a lot of the cases that involved either my work at the Observer and or in my individual capacity as this particular case was. So I was in a situation where I was trying to start this newspaper. I was given bail eventually, and I was ordered to report to the police station. I think it was twice a week. My passport was confiscated and so on. And eventually, after the case was dropped in early 1985, I was given the passport back and so on. But in the meantime, I knew that I was very closely being watched, my actions, and I had to report to the police, and it was quite a trying time. So then I found out that there was some interest in, that there was a possibility that we could get funding through an organization in the UK who said that there was possibly funds from the then European Community, which is now the EU, in terms of the anti-apartheid fund, that there could possibly be startup funds available to get this paper off the ground. But what preceded that was also a lot of effort. I had gone to New York also in 1984. I had basically walked the streets of New York, from the churches to the Ford Foundation to the United Nations Committee for Namibia, backwards and forwards, trying to get support for funding the paper. And I must say that that trip, although I was helped by someone like late Theo Ben-Guribrab, making introductions and so on, and meeting with the Council for Namibia and so on, but that came to naught. It didn't seem as though there would be any funds. So I was fairly depressed about that. So it was really good news when we heard from this organization in the UK that there's the possibility of funds from the European community. So then we had a dilemma again. I was sitting here. I think my passport had just been, I was able to travel if I could, but it would be very obvious if I traveled, because I was definitely being watched very closely. So I went to Dave and I said, would Dave be prepared to travel to the UK and to try, and we had drawn up a proposal, as he probably told you. When I was unemployed, I earned a little part-time money by working as his secretary, who I think was then on maternity leave. And so we had typed up in the dead of night, we had typed up this proposal for an independent paper. And I said to Dave, you need to go to London. Then there was a problem. Dave said he would. And then the senior partner in the law firm, John Kirkpatrick, turned around and said to Dave, no, you can't go because there is no money. If you are doing this on behalf of Gwen Lister, then there needs to be money paid. We can't send you off, pay your trip, everything like that. So then I went home and I was really depressed once again. And I thought, what the heck am I going to do? I have no money.
Yeah.
I mean, in those days, probably a flight to the UK wasn't terribly much in terms of what we know it is today. It was probably a few thousand. And I thought, that's it. I mean, I can't proceed beyond this point. And then finally, I had a long chat with my good friend, Nico Bessinger. And I said to Nico, that's it. I don't know what I'm going to do. And he said, don't despair. We'll make a plan. And it wasn't a day or two later that Nico came to me, and there's this feature of the plastic bag that sort of comes up in my story of those years quite frequently. And he came with some Checkers or whatever it was, plastic bag, and put it on my table at home and said, here's the money, give it to Dave and let him go. So I went off to Lawrence and Bone, went into Dave's office, I remember, and put this plastic bag in front of Dave and said, here's the money for the trip, now go.
Until this day, you still don't know the sources of those funds?
No, well, vaguely, it came via the Council of Churches.
Okay.
That I know. But from where it came before that, I can't trace it back. But it was certainly a Council of Churches. And when I received it from Nico, I said to him, we will pay this back once we do get money and so on, which we did. So, as I say, Dave was then able to travel. John Kirkpatrick could not say no. And then, to cut a long story short, Dave met with everybody in the UK and came back and said, green light, it looks like we can go ahead.
Wow.
So, to cut a long story short, that's really how we got the funding and how the paper finally got off the ground. Although obviously it took a few months after that to really prepare and to find premises, and those are stories in themselves, how we eventually found an office in Love Street at the architect firm of Kerry McNamara, who was probably the only one of the few white businessmen in this town who kind of believed in what we were doing. And as I say, that also this had been preceded by me also traveling to Lusaka, apart from going to New York, and going to Lusaka and trying to get Sam Nyoma's sanction for us to get those funds. And initially, as I recount, I think in quite a lot of depth in my book, he was also negative about it. And he said to me, Gwen, it's not going to work. You are too obviously who you are. The authorities are going to ban, bomb, or, kind of stop you from getting a paper off the ground. Then it's just money wasted. He said, come into exile and you can work for Voice of Namibia or something like that. And I said, no ways. And I told the president to his face, I was not prepared to go into exile. At the time, there was a lot of talk about a number of whites, particularly in South Africa and the ANC, who'd gone into exile ostensibly to join the ANC, but who were really spies for the apartheid regime. And I did not want to be in that kind of scenario at all. And so I said to the president in his face, I said, with or without you, I really intend to start this paper. Yeah. And so he finally, at that same meeting, he saw I was really serious. and he gave his sanction.
You speak a lot about different organizations, Henry McNamara's architecture firm, at the time, the Council of Churches, and there's this idea that both pre and maybe a few years after the Namibian starts, there's a big civil society scaffolding as support structure for the Namibian. Let's talk about the early years afterwards. So maybe something pre-1990. How important is a civil society and various others in supporting the life of the paper?
Very important, and I would say in particular the Council of Churches, which was in those days something to be reckoned with, unlike today, when it's almost been totally discredited and, in my viewpoint, totally useless, really, and doing nothing for the socio-economic circumstances of Namibia and Namibians in general. But back then, the Council of Churches was very, very active. They were very outspoken, and to a certain degree, the churches had a measure of protection because they were churches. And obviously, I think it was, perhaps thinking about it with hindsight, the apartheid regime, obviously they were very highly religious, believing in their Dutch Reformed Church and so on. So they had a real respect for churches, even if those churches believed in liberation theology and so on. So the churches were somewhat, but not totally, untouchable. And so, especially in the early years of our reporting, the Council of Churches was always there to kind of back up all our stories that we wrote, particularly about atrocities that were happening, particularly in the north of Namibia, but not only. That we would always come in with the Council of Churches and get their comment and get Bishop Kaluma's comment or Bishop Domeni's comment or something like that, which would give weight to the stories and make it more difficult for the apartheid regime just to dismiss it as propaganda. So that was very key. And later on, I mean, it wasn't just the Council of Churches. I mean, the student movement, NUNSO, were very supportive, as were the unions, which were also so much more active in those days than they are today. And obviously, perhaps it was because we were in a situation of war. I often try and compare the pre and post independence Namibia and how different it was and has been. Even our culture as a people has changed so dramatically, for the worse, I'm afraid to say. But then there was this great sense of solidarity and support among and in civil society. And then not long after the Namibian started, and just to go back to Dave, as he's probably also told you, Dave helped me sort of do things like find our premises, get a bank account started, do this sort of nitty-gritty, while I tried to focus on the editorial side of things, find young reporters, how are we going to start this paper, with who, obviously offered jobs to all the former Observer employees who were jobless. A couple of them came on board, others had already found something in the interim or left Namibia. So a couple of them did join the founding staff of the Namibian. But there was a lot to do, so I had to focus on the editorial, on the look and feel of the paper, on working on the masthead and the slogan, and how we were going to organize the paper, whether there would be training, getting the equipment, things like that. And Dave took care of that, sort of the banking side of things, and helped find us a part-time accountant, because we started, as most people know, with a staff of 10 people in all. It was a very small staff for at least a year. And everybody had to do a bit of everything. And Dave, in the early days when we actually started publishing, would come just about every day after work, after he finished at the law firm, and he would look over the front page and tell us, oh, you can't do this. Yep, you can do it. Because obviously it was a minefield for us. We knew that the authorities were looking for every opportunity to shut us down. And of course, prior to actually getting into print, you're probably aware, and Dave was very instrumental in this, the newspaper, we had to register the newspaper in terms of the Post Office Act and the Newspaper Imprint Act, I think it was, of South Africa. And we registered, and the then interim government, who was chaired at the time by Moses Kashiongwa, demanded from the paper a 20,000 deposit, which was a lot of money back in 1985.
Yeah.
And the rationale was that the paper, because of me and my political affiliations, as they saw it at the time, could become a threat to national security and disturb public order. So this huge deposit was levied on the paper. Again, we thought, oh my gosh, now we'll never get it off the ground. But we paid the deposit. We managed to do that without prejudice. And Dave, of course, took the matter to court. And finally, the deposit was overturned by a progressive judge, because even then, at the height of apartheid, sometimes the courts could surprise us with very progressive judgments. And Judge Levy set aside the deposit, and I remember our headline on that day was victory. And Dave and I walking out of court, that we'd had this set aside. So he used to check very carefully the paper in case that we were, but I mean, it didn't always matter whether he had or not, because they were after us, but that's what he did from then on. And gradually he, as I say, because of he started the Legal Assistance Center, and then later become a judge, and of course he had to distance himself slowly.
There's been a very obvious mission for the Namibian pre-1990. Take us into what happens post-1990 in the position of the Namibian, as it was a big contributor to the country's independence, but now a regular newspaper, if you want to call it that, in the media landscape. What's the position of the Namibian? Are you finding yourself with a little bit of a conundrum where you don't know what your personality looks like now, post 1990? What's your impact and your stance on the media landscape at the time? What's happening on the Namibian's character at the time, post 1990?
Yeah, first, sorry, perhaps I cut my own self off, but I should mention that after Dave started the Legal Assistance Center, not long after we started the newspaper, and he headed that up, again, the Legal Assistance Center became a very important part of the civil society landscape in Namibia. And again, they were always there, and we worked very closely with them, as you can imagine, also with regards to, for example, coverage of atrocities, where we would give coverage, let us say, to some or other terrible civil rights infringement in northern Namibia or elsewhere, whether it be arrests of SWAPO people, or detention without trial, or just, murder of people. The legal assistance would take up the matter. So there would be a story in the newspaper, and then there would be a court case after that. So the synergies between the Namibian, the Legal Assistance Center, the Council of Churches were very, very close indeed. Just wanted to say that as well. Come 1990, and the country has finally got independence. Yep, we had to look at ourselves and say, okay, here's the newspaper we started, first and foremost, to push for self-determination for Namibians. That's now been achieved. Here we are, we've had our elections, we've got a SWAPO government in power, which has what it was then a simple majority, not a 2/3. What do we do now? Where are we going as a newspaper? We believe in independent and free press, so that we will continue to kind of, how can one say, promote after independence, the importance of that. Now in a democracy, it's important to have outspoken press in a draconian era, but equally important in a democracy, to give people voice, to keep them informed, to enable them to become, active and informed participants in their own development. I think that was critical. So we sat down. I mean, there were things like, and I will mention that when I speak tomorrow, that our first slogan for the Namibian was bringing Africa south. And I think the rationale behind that was really, Namibia was then Southwest Africa. It was a mandate of South Africa and there beyond was Africa.
Yeah.
And we thought, okay, we need to now be in Africa and not part of this white minority regime anymore. So our first slogan was bringing Africa south. Then when we got to independence, we thought, okay, like we brought Africa south now, probably with a vengeance, probably more than we wanted to, if we look at things today, the way things have turned out. But now we need to think about what is our role. And so we just sat down and we said, no, will we continue holding truth to power? We did that back then. We will do it now. There will be an elected government. Our support was for self-determination of Namibia, and they've exercised their voice. And they've got a government of their choice. But equally now, we have to hold that government to account. So there's no real change. The change, I think, was in people's perceptions. Because of the Namibians' role prior to independence, many people saw it as a SWAPO newspaper. That was never the case. It was never the case. Our judge, I've never taken orders from anyone, political or otherwise, and never would. But that was the perception because of our coverage. And obviously, that was a perception that the apartheid regime fed into in order to discredit the Namibian. I mean, they kept saying SWAPO paper, Gwen's a SWAPO. I mean, it was so bad that I would walk in town and, I mean, white people would grab their kids and run to the other side of the road. There's that communist, you know. The Republican, for example, which was very pro an internal settlement at the time, would do cartoons of myself and Anton Lubowski virtually every single day. Gene Travers got out his pen and made me look absolutely dreadful. I was covered in flies. I was always with Nyoma in these cartoons. And so people saw me as this, like, really, they were really petrified of me in some ways. So, you know, as I say, one has to laugh about these things in hindsight, but they weren't necessarily funny at the time because it did set the forces of darkness after us. And I mean, that's why we had that baptism of fire that we had with my arrests, with attempted assassinations, with firebombing of the offices, with death threats day and night. I mean, it was incessant in those days, you know. So here we are at independence. We've got to reinvent ourselves. And we've got to cover different things. And in some ways, we've got to also adapt to a new era where we have a constitution now which says a free and independent press is a right. And that was the good news. But here we were as a newspaper, we'd been donor funded up till then. The white advertising community, there were a few who were loyal advertisers even in the pre-independence days, but we certainly could not have sustained on that small contribution. Now we had to somehow get advertising. The donor funding was drying up. Donor funding had funded a number of anti-apartheid papers, ourselves in Namibia, a couple in South Africa and elsewhere in the subcontinent. But they all died after the funding dried up. They could not sustain. So really, we'd won the political fight to survive, come independence. But now, like the country, was the economic battle, the battle for self-sustainability. And that wasn't easy. And in some ways, to me, that was a more difficult thing to do than to actually survive the political fight. And so it took a number of years. There were some very difficult times where I would go home. I wouldn't let anybody else see how emotional I was, but I did not know how I could pay salaries at the end of the month and how we could sustain. There were a number of those occasions, and salaries weren't very big or anything in those days either. And I must say, there were still some donors out there who knew that this time of transition was going to be very difficult for us until we could find a time where the advertising community would come on board and we could sustain with advertising and sales of the paper. And so I must say, and I must personally acknowledge the assistance of the former Swedish ambassador here, Sten Rylander, who would always help when it really came to the point where I said, I can't. anymore. I just can't. And came to our assistance. But it was in 1994 that finally we broke even. It was just so amazing. Slowly but surely, the advertising community, the face of the business community changed. Their attitude towards the Namibian changed. They could see here was a paper that might have been dubbed the Swapo mouthpiece prior to independence, but here was a newspaper that was actually holding the new government to power as well. So perhaps they weren't so bad after all. And so slowly but surely, because prior to independence, someone like Gwen Lister, who, as you know, was the owner of the breweries and very close to President Sam Nujoma, had dubbed me the Gaddafi of journalism in Namibia. And we had at one point, prior to independence, basically called for a boycott against Namibia breweries, also because they had a major strike at one point, and they tried to import scab labor and they beat up employees. And I remember we had a whole newsroom was full of workers from the breweries sitting there with bandaged heads and bleeding all over the show. And we declared a boycott against the breweries because of that. So Gwen Lister was not a fan of mine, nor I of him.
Yeah.
And so, as I say, things like that. But slowly but surely, the business community realized we can give support. And we didn't have a huge salary bill or anything else like that. But slowly, 94, we broke even. And then we started to do well as a newspaper and sell equally well.
Let's shift gears and time travel to your time post in Namibian. We know extensively what happens from the late 90s up until your time in 2011. The big stories have come out at the time, the Avid stories and various others. But as you're leaving, what are you hoping for the Namibian come that time in 2011? What are you leaving with?
Well, it was also a time that was very difficult for me personally. I'd made a pledge way back when we started the paper, because part of what was involved with founding the Namibian was also to train a cadre of Namibian journalists, black journalists, if possible, because then there were a lot of expatriate South Africans who were working here for the media. And so that was part of the plan. And eventually, my promise really was to put a black editor in my stead. And I think it was anyway, that was my mission. And for one or other reason, it happened fairly quickly that we came upon Tangeni. He came on board as a journalist. I saw that there was definitely a talented person there. He left then and he went to the Mail and Guardian in South Africa. So he did a stint there. But obviously it was a time where we had to, change had to come at some point or another. In 2011, I'd already been at the helm of the Namibian for 26 years. And on the 25th anniversary, I said, we will put a black person in the editor's role. Once we did so, and Tangeni was installed as editor, and I remember the day that it actually happened in October 2011. It was exactly. And former President Hifikepunye Pohamba had just rescinded the ban on the Namibian that President Nujoma had put there in 2001, a ban on the advertising and purchase of the Namibian on the grounds that the Namibian was anti-government. And he'd rescinded that. So it seemed like it was a new era, a new chance for somebody younger, to really make a difference and take the newspaper now to a different level. And I think I left at the time that the newspaper was very, very strong indeed. The sales were great. The journalism was good. Everything seemed to be, I left on a bit of a high, if you like. And so I was very positive about that. But personally, I was in a very negative space myself, because I do remember going home that night, and I've told Tangeni this on a few occasions, and I cried and I cried, and I thought, what have I done? I have given up the love of my life, something that has sustained me really for decades. And here I've just given my job away, and what am I going to do now? And my love of journalism and my passion for the Namibian and the excitement of a newsroom and even the challenges. Somehow, you know, when people say, would you do it again? Of course I would. I would do it all again, warts and all. So I was quite devastated, actually, at the time. But then I thought, no, you know, it's important. Change must happen. It's not always to one's liking, but it's got to happen. And new people must come to the fore. And now, of course, up to that point, I'd been the be-all and the end-all at the Namibian. I called all the shots. I had no board. I had no directors. I could decide what to do. And it was amazing. I loved it because, for example, in 2001, I suddenly thought, okay, now we're making this profit. We are improving circumstances of the staff. We've given them now medical aid and bonuses and paternity and maternity leave, and things are looking up, and we still have some money over. So how can we put back into the community? And I knew Namibians have this huge passion for football. And I actually met with then NFA chairperson, who was Petrus Damasep. And I sat down with Petrus and I said, what about a football competition that involves all the regions for the youth, and we play it out once a year, and we put our sponsorship into this? And he thought it was a great idea. And eventually we had toing and froing with the NFA because they liked the idea as well. I think there was still the consortium at the time that were actually supporting football in Namibia. And I came up with this idea of the regions playing off, and the consortium wanted in, and I kept them out. And I said, no, this is ours, the Namibian Newspaper Cup. We're going to do this. We're going to sponsor this. And we don't want, for example, things like the NFA wanted to charge fees for entry. Yeah. I said, no, this must be free. Namibians already, there were signs that the social fabric is not as it should be in Namibia. Unemployment was rising. I thought this was something that would give hope to the youth. The soccer selectors would be there, and if there was talented footballers from Curris or Kavango or wherever, they could be seen by the selectors and go up into the Brave Warriors, and this would give hope to so many unemployed youth, particularly in all the regions. We'd move the competition around in the regions so that it would also bring a bit of economic benefit when the football. So I thought this was an amazing idea, and it got off to a really good start. I think, I can't even remember what was our first, it was something like 600,000, I think, for the first football cup, which was the Namibian only. And then Christoph Miletsky had come on board as the news editor of the Namibian. Well, he'd been there a while, but he was someone who also took this to heart, and he really helped drive the football competition from then on. And I think when we look at 2025, if I'm not incorrect, we've had it every year to date, except for the COVID years. Exactly. And it was something I think Tangeni wasn't entirely sure about when he came on board. But I said, you know, Tangeni, obviously it's your decision now what to do, whether to have it or not to have it. But I said, you know, it's kind of wormed its way into the hearts and minds of people at this moment. So you'd be taking a chance and somebody else is going to grab that opportunity. It's something that people really look forward to as an annual event, usually falling over the Easter weekend, where people, as I say, and one of the reasons I insisted that the NFA make it free entry is to give people the opportunity, keep them out of the shebeens and the drinking places, take their family to the football, wherever it's being held, and enjoy a sport. Possibly it's not happening to the degree that I would like it to be, and obviously to deal with what is happening in Namibia at the moment will take more than a football competition. But things like that, I was able to take those decisions and say, I didn't have to talk to a board or get approval, and that was the part I loved about my job. But when I handed over to Tangeni, I realized we now need structure, right? We need a board of directors for the Namibian. We need an ownership trust. We had started a printing press, which we were, at the time, I think it was 50-50 ownership. And so the company was getting bigger. It was expanding. Things were changing. And so I thought, okay, that's where I need to focus my efforts now, is creating that ownership structure of the Namibian and looking at possibly starting a foundation. In other words, the Namibian, as most people know or don't know, some people still think I'm the owner and a terribly rich woman. That's not the case. But I set it up because we started the Namibian with donor funds from other countries. Taxpayers of other countries helped start the Namibian. So I felt that it should be set up as a trust. So there were never any owners of the Namibian, and nobody was paid shareholding or anything like that. So it was set up as a trust, originally as a non-profit trust. But that was a bit of a misnomer, in the sense that we didn't believe at the time we set it up that we would ever be in a profit situation. We just couldn't see that happening. But of course, as time went on, we realized to do the things we want to do, we need to make profit. And there was a time, for example, in the 80s when I would sort of took strategic decisions, and when advertising came on board in the 90s, I robbed Peter to pay Paul. I would use advertising money to subsidize the sales of the paper, because, as you probably know, the Namibian cost nothing. It was 50 cents and eventually went up to $1. But still, it was a lot of money for people in remote areas and rural areas in particular. So, and we had to get the paper there, and it was expensive. There were times we worked out that it would cost about $10 to get a paper to Usikos. So even the $1 you got back from the sale of the paper just did not compensate for the cost. So we had to very carefully juggle those things to make the paper accessible and to make the news and information accessible to people. And I think probably at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons people themselves dubbed it the People's Paper, because they knew that this was not just a money-making outfit that was there to fleece everybody and put money into the profits of shareholders. So back to 2011, and I realized, okay, we need to start with the structure, which we did, setting up firstly a board of directors for the Namibian itself, and then slowly we created the trust, the NMT, Namibia Media Trust, which is the holding company. And then, of course, later as well, which we started just after I left, but it was in its nascent stages, the NMT Media Foundation. So that, as you know, the Namibian, even though these are tough times for newspapers in general, the little bit of profit they generate also goes towards the foundation to help with the work of promoting press freedom, free press, training of journalists, and really keeping the ethos of the founding document of the Namibian at heart, and trying to help journalism elevate itself to levels. So today we have the printing press, we have obviously the Namibian and Tangeni started Desert Radio, and there's also the NMT Media Foundation. So yeah, it's grown from a small little newspaper, well, a small newspaper with a big heart, back in the 80s of a staff of 10, to today, goodness, I don't know what the total staff is of all the entities. So it's encouraging to see that. But at the same time, we all know that particularly print, and that is still at the heart of this group, is the Namibian, is in jeopardy. And people don't want to read anymore.
I want us to end off on that note, Gwen, because we could probably spend 40 years talking about the Namibian. But perhaps in the last few minutes that we have with each other, all these challenges that are here, and I spoke to Tangeni about that as well. It's that slow death of print that everyone talks about. It's the issue of the quality of journalism these days. It's the issue of the wages, all these challenges that journalists constantly talk about, that everyone else attacks journalism on. How do you see the next 40 years panning out?
40 years, that's a biggie. But, I'd prefer to focus on the more immediate future, particularly of print. Now, I probably buck against all the trends, because everybody, and I know Tangeni, everybody tells me print is dead. I'm saying, guys, just hang in there. You know, things change. I remember, back in the days when we started television, and people used to stare there at the test pattern that was on the screen until that went live later in the evening. I remember my kids sitting there and saying, when is it going to come on? And things change. Technology advances. Social media has become this, what can I call it? Not a good word, I want to use it, because once upon a time when the internet really started coming into its own and social media was there, and we saw, okay, here's this Twitter, and oh my goodness, there's the Arab Spring, and look, they're using Twitter to organize for the Arab Spring to happen and things like that. Wow, this is something. In the past, the media was all about the editor's voice, and the editor decided what letter went in the paper and what one didn't, and what to put on the front page and what not. And suddenly you've got this open forum of social media where anybody can say anything. Great stuff. Is it? No. It's become a cesspool of fake news and misinformation and clickbait and everything that is awful. And I'm a person who does believe that the worm will turn, that there's a point that must be reached where people will say, you know what, I can't anymore. I don't know, I go onto Instagram simply to post my pretty pictures of scenic places in Namibia, for example. So I use it for that. It's my kind of little where I can look at my pictures. But you go on Instagram and the absolute rubbish and the absolute awful stuff that is coming through is driving me out of that space. And there are many people who've been on social media and left social media because it can be so toxic. And I often feel there must come a point, and I'm hoping that the people will realize that that's not the place to get their news. And I would say that there is still life for print. It's different. It's not the same. We're not going to have those hundreds of thousands of copies, and I'm talking globally now, where newspapers sold out, but it is still the place where the good journalism is happening. It's not particularly happening online to any great degree, not yet, although that it will, I think, in future. It doesn't happen on radio. There's no real investigative journalism on radio and so on, and television to a certain degree. It's still, I think, if you think back on all the greatest news stories ever told, they come from newspapers. So I think there is life for print, but I think we have to be very, very circumspect as we go forward as to how to do that. First and foremost is to get advertisers back. And I think even advertisers will get sick of supporting rubbish on social media. They need to come to the party. They need to know that good journalism, whether it's in a newspaper, whether it's online, needs to be supported. And likewise, people themselves need to wake up. They need to wake up. If I think back to the Namibian in the early days and how people would literally riot if that newspaper was not available in Oshakati on the same day or in Katima or wherever, they would get super angry because they were totally dependent on that. It was their main source of information. Now we need to build back trust. It's not easy to do, where people are, as you say, you've got your phone with you, everybody, all the time, walking with a phone, and there's immediate stuff happening. So who wants to read a long investigative piece? And yet that is still the kind of journalism, the kind of information that people need to really be informed participants in their own development and in democracy. So we need to look at the standards of our journalism. We need to elevate them. We must not marry ourselves to the lowest common denominator and say, well, if social media is getting all the attention, let's sensationalize. That's not the way to do it. I think we've got to stick to good journalism. We've got to put it in print, and we've not got to put it online, so that people need to buy a newspaper, because apart from anything else, we've lost a reading culture in this country. We've totally lost it. And it's evident. It's evident in our education system. It's evident in our working lives. People are becoming illiterate. We are dumbing down as a result of this social media phenomenon, and we're not reading anymore. So obviously, we've all got to apply our minds if we're serious about the future of good journalism, because that's really what it's about, whether it's in print form or anywhere else. How do we get back people's trust? How do we ensure that children once again start reading? I remember my kids would read the Namibian. Have you ever seen a child read the newspaper? You know, they need to develop that reading culture. And I'm not saying it's the be all and end all and only to be found in the Namibian. It needs to be libraries and things like that. And somehow, as I say, I'm hoping the worm will turn, that the newspaper itself will not be the same as it ever was, but it will be there for as long as we can keep it there. But it's up to the advertisers to come on board and support good journalism, take their money off Facebook and those places and put it where it's going to make a difference in people's lives.
Right.
And hopefully we can keep it going in one form or another.
Gwen, I'd like you to just look at that camera there. A short 30-second message to the Namibian, not only the current staff, but throughout time, really, and your message on 40 years.
Yeah. 40 years, yes, 4 decades. It's almost, it's a bit like a gut punch, you know. It means I'm old, number one. Number two, but yes, you know, tribute has to be paid. This has been all about the people. It's been the people who started the Namibian along with me. It's the people we wanted to serve over the years. Those people who were lived under the jackboot of apartheid under horrible circumstances, who needed to be informed and were informed by the Namibian. But equally, the people today, who are, majority of whom are unemployed and feeling hopeless about the future of their lives, and holding truth to power. And these are the things I think that we need to keep up with. We need to represent always in the service of the people. It happened 40 years ago. It's got to happen going forward. And so thanks to staff, past and present, not only the journalists, because they always get the attention, but also, you know, the people in finance and distribution and accounts who keep the wheels oiled and going in order for the journalists to do their job. So kudos to them all for their service over the years. Again, I think it's a place that requires passion. Everybody knows if they go and work at a newspaper, they are not working at a parastatal and they don't pay the same. That doesn't excuse that we need to pay decent wages and that we need to make people safe and comfortable in their work, whatever they do. So thanks to all those staff, and a big thanks to, especially from my perspective, to the people of Namibia who made the Namibian what it is. Without their support, the Namibian would not have become the brand it has become today. So likewise to them and everybody else who supported. Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary indeed. And we end our conversation with the founding editor-in-chief of the Namibian, Gwen Lister. Thanks for your time, Gwen, and happy 40th to you as well.